Come to the group of terms that we're really after in Christian ethics, and that's the group of the agapao terms. This is a group of terms that we are really after, the agapao terms, A-G-A-P-A-O. Because this ends up in the New Testament being love in its highest expression and embodied in its most sublime conception. And how all the various words in the agapao group, especially the noun agape, have come to have such significance in the New Testament is the interesting story behind the story. We're going to be chiefly this evening, we're going to be looking at the agapao group of terms. We're going to be chiefly looking, first of all, at the usage in the Septuagint, and then secondly, the usage in the New Testament. Now, that's the verb. The noun, agape, A-G-A-P-E. Agape is what? We could say probably the most famous of all the Greek terms. The most famous as far as we are concerned. Probably the best known by everyone here. If you've heard of any of these terms, maybe you've heard of eros, maybe not. Maybe you've heard of phileo, maybe not. Maybe, probably not, have you heard of epithemia and ones of that nature. And maybe you've never heard of agapao. But I would assume that everybody has heard of the noun form, and that is agape. The noun agape is totally lacking among Greek writers prior to the time of the Septuagint, prior to the 2nd century to the 3rd century BC. The noun agape is totally lacking among Greek writers. It is found, and this is unique and it's rather interesting, and the explanation is not known. It is found among some Jewish writings that come around this same time. Here's a list of the Jewish writings where the noun, now agapao, the verb, is found in other Greek writings. Agape does not appear at all, not even for the first time, in Greek writings prior to the LXX. It's found in some Jewish writings, such as the letter of Aristeas. That's supposed to give us our origin, tell us our origin for the LXX. We looked at that in biblical literature when we discussed the Septuagint. A-R-I-S-T-E-A-S, Aristeas. It's found in Philo. And then it's found in some of what we call the Testament books. The Testament of Reuben, Testament of Gad. These are some of the Old Testament pseudepigraphal works. The Testament of Asher, sons of Israel, of course. The Testament of Joseph, Testament of Benjamin. It's found in the Psalms of Solomon. And it's found in the Sibylline Oracles. S-I-B-Y-L-L-I-N-E. So it's found in those several places for a total of around 15 times. That's not more than 1.5 or so per writing then, for a total of 15 times. So what we're saying about the agape term, we're just talking about agape right now, and it is basically similar with the other agapao terms, is that they are relatively rare in Greek writings prior to the 2nd and 3rd century BC. The most important ancient Greek term for love was phileo, which we said in the last teaching. The phileo terms were the most important terms in the old Greek writings. The agapao terms don't assume their significance and their importance until, well, relatively recent times, that is, recent to the New Testament. Now let's look at the appearances of the agapao terms, which are 4 in number, counting agapao, in the Septuagint. Okay, first of all, I've given the first of these up here to you, well, the first two. First of all, we have the chief term, agapao. We're talking about occurrences in the Septuagint. It's found in the Old Testament 216 times. And that's a large number of times. If you go back and compare phileo, you'll find out that they are almost identical in the number of times found. Now that's in the LXX Old Testament, but remember the LXX manuscripts that we have also include the Apocrypha. So it's found in the Apocrypha of the LXX 54 times. Now the Apocrypha was not one of the works initially translated with the Old Testament and put together. That didn't come until later centuries. For a total of 270 times, agapao, a total of 270 times in the Septuagint. And then the next related term, agape. Agape. It's found in the Old Testament. That's A-G-A-P-E. It's found in the Old Testament 16 times. It's found in the Apocrypha 4 times for a total of 20 times. Now notice how rare the term is. The verb is used almost 300 times. In comparison, the noun is hardly used at all. Then a third term, agapesis. A-G-A-P-E-S-I-S. Agapesis. Another one of the agapao terms. The most famous, of course, is agape. Really the most important to begin with is the verb. We have to get our other words from the verb, and the verb is agapao. Agapesis in the Old Testament 9 times, in the Apocrypha 2 times, for a total of 11 times in the Septuagint. Then finally, we have our final term, agapetos, A-G-A-P-E-T-O-S, agapetos. It's the adjective. In the Old Testament 18 times, in the Apocrypha 5 times, for a total of 23. So we have agapao 216 in the Old, 54 in the Apocrypha, for a total of 270. Agape 16 in the Old, 4 in the APOC, for a total of 20. Agapesis, 9 in the Old, 2 in the APOC, for a total of 11. And agapetos, 18 in the Old Testament, 5 in the Apocrypha, for a total of 23. That gives us a total of 259. Wait a minute, I need to add those all the way up. 324 to add them all the way up. Then 259. The Old Testament, and 65 for the Apocrypha. And notice the big term out of them all is the verb agapao, a total of 270 times. So we're chiefly concerned with the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament we have the agapao terms found 259 times. That's in the Old Testament. In the Apocrypha, 65 times, for a total in the LXX manuscripts of the agapao terms of 324. Okay, let's go to just what we're talking about in the Old Testament. 259 appearances of agapao or one of its related terms. Of these 259 Old Testament occurrences, 196 of them are the translation of words associated with the Hebrew achev. Now, I think we discussed those terms, some of the Hebrew terms, when we were looking at responsibilities to God, and one of them was to love God. Then we looked at some of the Hebrew terms, and we didn't look at the Greek terms because I said we'd be then to the Greek terms at a later time, and of course that's where we are now in looking at responsibilities to ourselves to manifest these various fruit of the Spirit and various Christian virtues. So 259 out of that, 196 of them, vast majority of them, of the agapao references and occurrences in the Old Testament, are the translation of words that are associated with what was the chief Hebrew concept for love, and that was the ahev, A-H-E-V, ahev term. No other word for love is represented by the agapao words more than 10 times. In other words, we've still got 65 more references in the Old Testament that don't cover the ahev terms in this 196 here. And so of those terms, no single one of those is represented in the LXX by an agapao term more than 10 times. That is, more than 10 times per word. So let's say we've got a maximum of the second word, the second leading word, a maximum of 10 agapao terms to refer to that particular Hebrew term, which is different than the ahev. Well, that's 10 compared to 196. So in other words, they felt there was a very close relationship, not between the phileo terms or eros or something like that, but between the agapao term, which was becoming an important Greek term. It's not the most important yet. It's becoming. It's going through a transition period. But there was a relation between that and what they felt was the chief Hebrew Old Testament concept and word for love, and that was ahev. So they had a predilection toward agapao and agape, not as much for agape, but particularly for agapao, in using it and trying to find, in other words, in trying to find a Greek word that would adequately translate the Hebrew concept of ahev. Now let me just give you some grammatical notes of these references here in the Septuagint. We're still talking about the Septuagint. Okay, I've got several of these. First of all, in no place of the 20 does agape refer to God's love. There were 16 times that agape appears in the Old Testament and 4 in the Apocrypha, for a total of 20 in the LXX. There's not a single one of those 20 places where agape has reference to God's love. You see, we're doing the study of the origin of these terms and how some of them, well, how all of them came to have the meanings that they, let's say, have by the time of the New Testament, because that's what would be important for us. Not a single reference. That means of these 20 times, we have to have references of man loving man, or a man loving his wife, or a man loving his dog, or something of that order. Or it could have reference to a man loving God, because all I've said is we don't have a single reference to God's love for man in the LXX under the noun agape. In 14, we're still under this same note here, in 14 of the 20 references, 14 of the 20 references of agape in the LXX, that's Old Testament as well as Apocrypha. Now that's more than half. That's almost 3/4. 14 of them have reference to, you want to take a guess? What do you think agape? It doesn't have reference to God's love for man. It has to be some other type of love. And what I'm trying to show you through this again is the multitude of misconceptions in lay teachings about these concepts here. There are just multitudes of misconceptions. And if you've never really heard teaching the little 3-step here of erotic love and phileo, brotherly love, and then God's love is agape love. And God's love is not phileo, and God's love is not eros, but God's love, and therefore our love should be agape. And it's this sublime, supreme, spiritual type of love that's of a heavenly nature and of a heavenly origin. And this is the important love. 14 of the 20 references, they have reference to what? What would you not think of for agape? Who has heard of the term agape now? Make sure I'm talking to everyone here. Okay, I'm talking to everyone here. You've heard of agape. How many of you have ever, maybe I should have started with these questions. How many of you have ever heard little lay teachings from little people about love, and they give you those 3 Greek terms, and they teach a little on? Okay, that's several people. Okay, you're familiar with eros and phileo and agape, or however they want to pronounce them. You're familiar with that. Several of you are, maybe half of you are out there. Okay, what does agape mean? In the LXX. Man to man. Okay, go a little lower than that. You know, and when I say lower, I mean
Man to beast.
man to beast. Halfway in between. What's halfway between a beast and a man? A woman. Obviously, a woman. Well, that's the best thing I could think of. You said a beast and then a man. What's in between? Okay. That was your fault. You made me do that, you see. Okay, so now if I've told you that much, then give me the answer from that. Man to woman. Okay, husband to wife. No, we're man and woman. Go lower than that. To sexual love. Not to this spiritual love between a man and a woman. 14 of the 20 LXX occurrences of agape are to sexual love. 11 of those, 11, that's more than half of the total, and almost all of these 14 of sexual love. 11 of those are just found in the Song of Solomon. That only has 8 chapters, you know. 14 of the 20 occurrences of agape in the LXX. That's a little tidbit to remember. You could just say most of the time that agape, not agapao now, that's 216 times, a total of 270 in the Old Testament and the Apocrypha for the LXX. But you could say most of the time agape is used in the Septuagint, it has reference to sex and not to marital love, man and woman without the act of marriage, not to man to God, man to beast, man to tree, God to man, or anything else. Now that will become important when we get to the data for the New Testament usage, which we will, of course, be getting to later on. So there's a very interesting grammatical note if you want to research these terms and find out how they are used and then help destroy just misconceptions that people have. And what I mean by misconception, we're talking about LXX right now. It's going to change by the time we get to the New Testament. Things will be a little different then. But still, I think people's concept of agape is that it's a heavenly term that maybe God invented or something, and that it initially had reference to God's love, the love that God has, and that's the highest form of love, and so we call it agape. Now, I'm not going to deny the fact that agape ends up being the expression for the highest form of love, but we're just looking back into its origin right now. Okay, a second grammatical note of the on the agapao terms in the LXX. The largest single block of the total number of references concerns love between persons of the opposite sex. Now that's of the 259 of agapao, agape, agapesis, and agapetos. Of those 4 terms, the agapao. I'll just keep saying the agapao terms so I don't have to say all 4. The largest single block of the total number, that is the largest block out of the 259, the total number of references, concerns love between persons of the opposite sex. This is the largest single block. You've got it in the context of a good type of love and then a type of love that produces bad things. To give an example of both of those, Genesis 24:67. Now, of course, this would be in the Septuagint. You would have some love term in the Hebrew here, and then they would be picking the agapao term or terms, one or the other, as the appropriate receptor term for the Greek language of the LXX. And I've said that the largest single block of the total number of the 259 references concerns love between persons of the opposite sex. Here's a good reference. Isaac brought her, his new wife now, Rebekah, into his mother Sarah's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he agapao. It's a verb. He loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. They picked one of the agapao terms to correspond to the Hebrew term that's found here. There's a good reference. Then over in chapter 34, I hate to say that it's a bad reference, because it's not so much a bad reference, but it doesn't have the purity of the two people of God there in Genesis chapter 24 and verse 67, because here you have one of the Hivites loving one of the daughters of Israel, as it were, and many problems are produced as a result of that. In short, he and all of his fellow villagers end up slaughtered by this young lady's brothers. And Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem the son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and defiled her. So I guess we could say it's kind of a bad reference. Not just the term love here in verse 3, but look what he did first of all. First of all, he commits fornication with her. And then verse 3, his soul clave unto Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he agapao, the damsel, and spake kindly unto the damsel. And they use one of the agapao terms, kind of now in a bad reference of a foreigner, a Gentile, a pagan, loving one of the daughters of Israel after he has committed fornication with her. In Genesis chapter 22 and verse 2, we happen to see a family reference here, I believe. Genesis 22:2. And here it comes from God's lips. He said, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest. Here it's not between members of the opposite sex, but here's one of the times where it's a family reference. And it's found on other occasions in the family context. And by that I mean not just between a man and a woman, but in the family. And here it's between a father and his son. So I said that the largest single block of these 259 references speak of love between persons of the opposite sex. And here's how we could break them down. 34 times agapao is used like this. Now that's 34 out of 216. The others are just used for such a variety. The other times of agapao are used for just such a variety of things. Then we've got 14 of the agape. 14 of the agapes, 16. For agape sis, 2 out of the 9. And for agape tos, the adjective, 1 out of the 18. For a total of 51 of the 259. Which means 1/5. That's the largest single block. 1/5 of the references are love between persons of the opposite sex. 51. Okay, another grammatical note. 41 times the agapao terms are used for love between two men. You could almost say love for objects or love for inanimate things would be the largest block, but it's so many different inanimate things, that's why I'm not classifying it as that. 41 times it's love between two men. Another grammatical note, another large section of the 259, is man's love for God. Probably the second largest block behind the 51 for love between persons of the opposite sex. Man's love for God, a total of 43 times. Man's love for God. Now what's different here in this grammatical note and all the things that we've seen thus far? Well, finally at this point, love in the agapao group begins to detour from the common Greek usage where it has an almost total emphasis in non-religious settings. That is really the interesting thing to say about this term in general, or about these terms, the agapao terms. All of these others, love between a man and a woman, sexual love, love between two men, love in the family, a father's love for his son. The word is used in the LXX to speak of love for such things as food or life, those who will love life. The agapao terms are used for that. And it's only at this point where we have man's love for God that we finally get away from how it was commonly used in Greek up until this time, where it has almost totally an emphasis in non-religious settings. Here's finally a spiritual, a religious setting, man's love for God. It's not man to woman, man to man, man to beast, man to life, man to food, man to some animate or inanimate object, but it's man to the Spirit, to God. Okay, now let's kind of sum up. What have we seen in all of this thus far? We get 324 references of the agapao terms in the Septuagint. And what we see at this time is that the agapao words are beginning in the 2nd and 3rd century BC. They are beginning to take over the role of importance from the phileo group. A process of development. You could call it evolution. In love terminology is taking place. Both of the words are going through changes in meaning, and both of the words are going through changes in popularity. I've said before that the most important old Greek term for love was phileo. That is beginning, just at the time the LXX is being written, that is beginning to pass off the scene of popularity. And of course it's being supplanted by the agapao terms, and the agapao group ends up the most important group in New Testament theology and writing. And that brings us to the New Testament. Let's look now at statistics for the agapao terms now in the New Testament. We've looked at the Septuagint. Now let's take a look at these terms as they appear in the New Testament. Now only 3 of these are found. The verb, the noun, the adjective. Agapao, agape, agapetos. So let's start in order as we've done before. Agapao, the verb, which means to love. The New Testament, 143 times. Now in the Old Testament, for the Septuagint, 216. An extra 70 times. But the Old is more than twice as large as the New. And so it's not twice as many in the Old. Notice how the statistics are changing. They're changing gradually, but they are changing. I'm going to skip down to the adjective. Agapetos. Agapetos, the adjective. New Testament, 61 times. How many for the Old and the LXX? Well, you can look up in your notes, 18. Now that's changed fourfold now. That has gone through quite a change. But the biggest change of all is with the noun agape. In the Old Testament, it had occurred just 16 times. In the New Testament, the noun agape, which means love, appears 116 times. So we have the verb agapao, to love, 143 times. The adjective agapetos, which means beloved, the adjective beloved, 61 times. And notice now that the noun has almost taken over the place of importance. It's not far behind the verb. Agape is appearing 116 times. Now, let's draw some charts here on our paper and our mind, one or the other, and statistically take a look at the totals of the LXX and the New Testament, of the phileo and of the agape terms, just for comparison's sake. And I'll be able to show you here on your paper, I'll show you statistically just what's taking place, this process of the evolutionary change in meaning and particularly in popularity here, as the agapao terms slowly but gradually begin to take over the role of importance from the phileo terms. Okay, we'll have 2 columns across the top of the paper horizontally, LXX, and then to the right of it, the New Testament. And then 2 columns vertically down the left of your page, phileo and agapao. Okay, phileo and the LXX, and I mean all the phileo terms, not just phileo, 261 times. 261 times in the LXX. The New Testament, 62 times. 62 times. Now I think we looked at 4 phileo terms, phileo and 3 other terms, and then we looked at 21 compound terms. You remember doing that? So that 62 just counts the 4 important words. Then if you add compounds, it totals 95 times. If you add those 21 compounds, and some of them, of course, found more than once, so you can't just add 21 to 62. One of them was found 5 times. 62 of the phileos in the New Testament. If you add the 21 different compound terms and then add the different times they appear, you'd have a total of 95. So we'll just add that on there. So we've got, thus far, for the phileo terms, in the LXX we have 261.
For the continuation of this message,
at 95, let's just say 100. So it's 150 difference there. Okay, for agapao. Now the most important ancient term in Greek for love is phileo. And by ancient I mean even prior to the LXX. The LXX, not just that writing of course, but that period in history is the period of transformation. Agapao, we're just talking now about the LXX Old Testament. Biblical material, canonical material, 259 times. The agapao terms, 259 times. That's 216 for agapao, 16 for agape, 9 for agapesis, and 18 for agapetos. Now notice that's 2 references apart. That's how close they are. That's well over 500 times that phileo and agapao are used for love in the LXX Old Testament. Well over 500 times. Notice how big a concept that is. And that's just for those 2 terms. And their cognates, over 500 times. But notice how close they are. Now, they're only 2 apart. Phileo is winning by 261 to 259. Now, if we had just moved back in history a couple of hundred years, then the phileo terms would have been larger and the agapao terms would have been even smaller. They started out, the phileo terms, as the important ones. And, you know, it starts out important and agapao down here low, and pretty soon they're going to equal each other. They're equaling each other now by the Septuagint time. And then pretty soon the agapao terms are going to grow. Now let's get over to the New Testament. Now we're 200 years later, and watch the transformation now. Phileo in the New Testament, 95 times we said. Agapao, 320 times in the little bitty short New Testament. 320 times. You add up the agapao, the agape, and the agapetos. 320 times. Now, by far, the New Testament, if you look at your 4 little statistics that you have now, you see that by far, agapao must be a very important New Testament concept, because it's not found as often. Neither is phileo in the Old Testament LXX, and neither is phileo in the New Testament. 261 and 95 to 259 to 320. Now let me ask you a question. Of these 3 agapao terms that I've given you, the verb, the noun, the adjective, agapao, agape, and agapetos, which of those, looking at the statistics that you have, which of those would be the most important term? in light of all of the other references that we've given you thus far? Well, you can't just go by the fact that agapao has a few more references, about 27 more references or so than agape. Agape definitely is the most important of the terms because of the jump in number of times between the Septuagint, 16 in the Septuagint, and what we have in the New Testament, 116. So some of what you've heard about the agape group of terms is correct. It's just that it's not complete, and not enough of the background is ever given. So we could probably go so far as to say this, that for all practical purposes, Christianity adopts a, quote, new, unquote, word. Agape is not new, but it's new, quote, unquote. And using agape so frequently, because that had never been done before in history. Now, agapao had been used much in the LXX. But agape, that's the term that we would have to major on in the New Testament. It's the noun agape. For all practical purposes, Christianity adopts a new word in the very frequent use of agape. That had never been done before. Now, it's important to note that the word did not originate with Christianity in the New Testament. By far, that is not the case. The word did not derive itself or originate from Christianity or the New Testament. It's used in the Septuagint. It's used in other Jewish writings, totally lacking in Greek writings prior to the LXX, but it's used in Jewish writings. But that's probably the popular one of many, one of several popular lay misconceptions that agape is a New Testament Christian term by its origin, and that's certainly not true. By its frequency of use, then that would be a correct statement. Here we do have a word that is uniquely a Christian New Testament term. Why? Why in the world do we see such a change in the popularity? Now, we haven't gone into meanings yet, not for this group of terms. You know what eros means, epithumia. You know what the Storge terms mean. There we go from passion in eros to strong passion in epithumia, covet, desire, lust. And then you go to the Storge, and we're back to familiar terms. Then when you go to the phileo terms, and you know we're talking about brotherly love. Evidently, this must have been the case. Although those terms were popular terms in Greek, none of those terms came without negative connotations or did not come in a strong enough fashion to be made the dominant New Testament Greek term for love. Now, it's either an A or a B. Either they came with too negative of implications, by guilt by association, we could say. Eros was not a bad term, but since it came to have very base meanings, not just in sexual love, but in plain lust, since it came to have bad meanings, and it's what we call guilt by association. And it's probably a good suggestion in various writings, such as in Philip's writings, that it was not used in the New Testament because it had been made guilty by associations with things like concupiscence and lust. And the same is true with epithumia. As far as the Storge terms are concerned, well, I've said before, that's familial love. God is our Father, we are His children, but there is a higher love in the universe than the love that any father, whether he's Christian or non-Christian, that any father has just in his natural feeling for his son or for his daughter, or a mother for her child, for that purpose. There's something higher than that. Phileo, it's the most important ancient Greek term. It's used almost 100 times in the New Testament. But it's 3 to 1, more than 3 to 1 beaten by the agapao terms in the New Testament. Why? Well, we're back to, again, not the fact that it's got negative associations that are too strong, but the other thing, it itself is not strong enough of a term. What does phileo terms mean? Brotherly love. There's a higher form of love than brotherly love. Brotherly love is a good type of love to have. And the New Testament encourages us to have brotherly love. Hebrews 13:1, let brotherly love continue. Philadelphia, remember, it's one of the compound terms there, Philadelphia, let brotherly love continue. 1 Thessalonians 4:9, have brotherly love among yourselves. 1 Peter chapter 4, have brotherly love. So we've got brotherly love. We've got the hospitable love. All of these are brotherly love terms. Why such a change? Why agape? And it's not just in Paul's writings, but it's chiefly in Paul's writings. He's a theologian of the New Testament era. He's a theologian of the early church. He's a theologian of the first century, but it's not restricted to him. It's found in other writings of the apostles of the first century in composing the 27 books of the New Testament. Now, for the Old Testament in the Septuagint, they only saw need for that term 16 times, love. Agape as the noun, love. They only found use of that of 16 times. The New Testament, 116 times. It's a semi-unique Christian term. Semi, I mean, it was not introduced, it did not originate with Christianity, but there's where it gains its supreme importance by the number of times that it's used. But the first thing we would ask ourselves after that is why? Well, that's what I'm answering. Why would it be used so frequently? Because the other terms either A, had too negative of associations, or B, they were not strong enough to express something that we're going to discuss in the New Testament. Okay, what's different between New Testament love and Old Testament love? They must have seen the need. I want you to notice this. Agape, the noun, was just not used. It's never found in Greek writings prior to the LXX. It's found only 16 times there. It's found in a few Jewish writings, the testaments of Reuben and Asher and Philo and the Sibylline oracles. But the total for those Jewish writings is 15. That's 31 times in those Jewish writings in the LXX Old Testament. Or 35 if you want to count the few that are found in the Apocrypha. Now that covers a lot of history, that covers a lot of different writings by different people. And it's a relatively rare term. The New Testament, all of a sudden, it's agape, agape, agape. Now, agapao, the verb, that's lessened in number of times. Lessened greatly from the times that it appeared in the Old Testament of the LXX. Now, even though it still beats by maybe 30 or so, the agape term in the New Testament, it doesn't seem to be important because why doesn't it double or triple? Or even more than that, as it does if you look at your LXX Old Testament statistics. Now it's only ahead by about 30. And that's just because maybe you needed a sentence with a verb in it more often than you had need for a noun in a sentence. And so you picked agapao instead of agape. And that would explain that away in a hurry. So, and if you take that explanation, then what you'd end up with is probably, if we would not have had need for the verb, everything would have been agape. Agape, agape, agape. Not just because they're trying to use the noun. Maybe I need to clear that up as well. It's because they're trying to express something new by a concept that had been used so infrequently in the past. And rather than invent a new term, why not just take a rarely used term and make it your major term? And that's what the New Testament theologians did. They, instead of inventing a new term, they took an obscure one. Agape was an obscure Greek noun for love. They took an obscure one because it was used infrequently and made it their chief term. Whether you need a noun or a verb, an adjective or an adverb, whether it's love to love, lovely or beloved, doesn't matter what category of speech, they wanted to make this, for some reason, they wanted to make this their chief term. The fellowship meal of the first century A.D. actually became known as, by its technical name, actually became known as the agape. And it was referred to as the agape feast, or the feast of love. And they used the noun agape. And it generally wasn't the love feast, it was shortened just to the agape. And the agape was the love feast. They named their most important communal meal after the most important love concept in the New Testament. That shows how important it was to have named the meal after that. You turn over to the book of Jude. Verse 12. Here we have a reference to it. Our clearest reference. Well, let me rephrase that. Our only reference by name. We seem to have references to it other places. Obviously in 1 Corinthians 11, and there's probably a reference in, 2 Peter 2. But there's a textual dispute over there as to whether the full name or any part of the name is actually used or it's just understood. Jude, verse 12. These are spots. Well, it's really not a spot. He uses a word there that is a shipping, a navigational term that meant like a reef, a hidden reef in the water. Because spot seems like he'd be talking about blemish there. He's talking about a certain group of people here. And they're not so much blemishes, but they are hidden reefs that will sink the boat of other Christians when you run upon them if you don't watch out. And they are hidden reefs in your feasts of charity. Agape, your feast of love, that became known as the agape. They named their most notable communal meal after this important, which has now become, in New Testament theology and writing, this important Greek noun for love. Well, we're still waiting for the answer to the question why. What is different between Old Testament love? I mean, it's still God's love. What is different between Old Testament love and New Testament love? Why did the apostles, why did the early church see the need of, quote, inventing, unquote, you know I don't mean invent in the technical sense, they just use an obscure one, but inventing a new term here, when they had plenty of terms? They even had agapao to use. And why is it they're always wanting to get back to that noun? Maybe even to the point in some places of writing the sentence in such a way that it would take a noun instead of taking the verb. And agape became the term. How many of you, let's go over this, before you ever came here, I hope this will prove something, how many of you had ever heard of the term agape? Okay, hands down. How many of you had ever heard of the term agapao? Okay, it proves what I wanted it to prove there. Why is it you knew the noun and not the verb? The noun has become the important thing in Christianity. Just a few of you raised your hand for the verb, and almost all of you raised your hand for agape. Why? And a verb really is the more basic part of speech. We get our nouns from our verbs. The verb is really the more basic part of speech, or you just have a lot of nouns and you don't know what's going on. Just tree, sun, that's all. You don't know that, oh, the sun makes the tree grow. Oh, now I see what you're talking about. You could just put grow in there, at least we'd know what action was taking place. We'd need some nouns to know what was doing it and what was causing it. Agape. Why? We're still on the same question. Why? Why do they see it, the need? And we pass this down, and I remember a certain Christian sister that she used to always sign her letters that way. She signed them agape. And I didn't think then, but I think now, I wonder if she knew what she was really doing. I mean, it was fine to do that. That's a good Christian term, but I wonder if she knew why. She had heard in little lay pop teachings that agape, and if it's only Greek words you can pronounce, you like to use it a lot, you know. So you go around saying agape. Well, what are you really saying? Well, I'm saying love. That's exactly right. That's the noun of love. But, well, obviously they couldn't give any statistics. And even if they could they then go on and give us the answers for the statistics? Why take time to study the statistics? Except that we're ending up with the popularity seen in the frequency of use of this noun agape. If you're not going to give me a suggestion, I'm going to give you my suggestion. Why they saw, the New Testament theologians saw that they had a need to make something important with love, with the noun.
Show us God's love.
Okay, didn't he love in the Old Testament?
It was more of a command type love.
No, what about,
To us.
okay, that's what I'm looking for there. What's the chief thing that's different between the old and new? Well, faith is the same. Our love to God is supposed to be the same. I mean, the concepts are all there, but what changes? What changes the whole dispensation from old to new is the sending of Jesus Christ. Back over to 1 John. We've looked at these passages before. 1 John chapter 4. John, remember, is the beloved disciple. There's our adjective there, agapetos. He's the beloved disciple, and of course, every lay Bible pupil knows that John's books have much to say about love. He was always saying, according to church tradition, and it's fairly well based right on New Testament as well, like 1 John 4:7, in his meetings, "Beloved, let us love one another," or "Little children, let us love one another." 1 John 4, we're going to start with verse 7. Now, the first of those verses deal with false prophets, false spirits, deceiving spirits. And then all of the rest of this chapter and the first few verses of the 5th chapter, he's into the subject of love. Now, he had been there in the middle of the 3rd chapter and the beginning of the 2nd chapter, and his chapter where he deals with most of it here is in these verses from 7 down through 5:3. "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and every one that loveth is born of God and knoweth God." Now, he's using the verb a lot, obviously, but he'll use the noun some as well. The verb's used more, but that doesn't prove anything because it should have been used double or triple or 5 or 6 times as many as the noun, according to the LXX Old Testament. "He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is agape. In this," and here's one of the verses that we're looking for, "in this was manifested God's agape toward us." Old Testament Septuagint only 16 times. New Testament 116 times. "Because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world that we might live through him." They obviously, and this goes without saying, saw the advent and the death of Christ as the most important event in human history. And it was only appropriate to take a term, if you're not going to coin a new one, take an obscure one, and use it chiefly to have reference to this one act of God. This is God's agape, is the sacrifice of his Son. Herein is agape, not that we agapao God, but that he agapao us and sent his Son to be our agape, to be the propitiation for our sins. You can jump back in chapter 3 and verse 16. "Hereby we can perceive God's agape, because he laid down his life for us." Now, how could you really perceive that in the Old Testament? It was more difficult to perceive. They recognized God's love. That's acknowledged in the Old Testament. But we're told, hereby we perceive God's love. That must mean there was some type of perception of it that was available since New Testament times, since the cross, since Calvary, that was just not available prior to that time. If you jump over into Paul's writings in Romans chapter 5, we'll see the same thing again. Paul is the one who's using the term so much, but John is using it many times as well. Romans 5, in this famous passage, verses 6 through 8. "For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die." And notice how he's going to get this concept of love into the whole picture of Jesus and Calvary. "But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." There seems to be such a connection in the New Testament between agape and the cross, to the point that the two are inseparable. Obviously, to the point that the two are inseparable. The two go together. How about back in John's writings, the familiar verse in chapter 3 of his Gospel, the 16th verse, For God so loved the world. Now he's using the verb, but it's still the same concept. That he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Most of the times that the love concepts, whether it's phileo or agapao, are found in the New Testament, they are found in the spiritual sense. Now see, that's not true for the Old. It's love of life, love of health, love of things, love of inanimate objects, many different types. That's why I didn't break that up as making the largest single block. Or if we want to take the largest single block of one particular thing, love between members of the opposite sex. New Testament, we've got 100 times phileo occurs, over 300 times for agapao terms, 500 times almost of love terms just in the New Testament. And the vast majority of them are in the spiritual sense of God loving us, or of we loving God, or of brother loving brother in the Christian sense. So here's what we've said thus far this evening. We're not through yet. We're going to look at a few more things. We'll be through tonight, but we still won't be through yet with these statistics and these terms. Most of the other Greek terms had inherent problems. Not all of them, but most of the other terms, Greek terms, had inherent problems for the sublime use that was needed in New Testament Christianity. The verb agapao had been used before, but the Christians, just like with the noun, bring it new meaning by having it occur many times more often than the phileo term. It's also good to remind ourselves again, they never used the erao or the eros term at all in the New Testament because of its bad associations. And perhaps the greatest way to really see the change, now not just in popularity, but the change in the concept, the change that's taken place in people's concept of love, is to recall the two chief characteristics of eros. Do you remember what those were? What were the two things that characterized eros love? Love of the worthy and a desire to possess. And agape turns both of these things around. Agape's meaning, not definition. It's difficult to define any of these terms. We gave you a definition for Christian love, and basically it was between brother and brother, although it could relate to God. Agape turns both of those things around, obviously, to the reverse. Agape, the agapao terms, were love of the unworthy, and were love that gave rather than desired to have. So that changes quite a bit from eros to agapao. Eros was love of the worthy and love to possess. Agape is love of the unworthy and a love to give. For God so loved the world that he gave. He did not hold his Son back to himself. And that was because of the love that he had for us. It's said this way in Romans 8:32, he that spared not his own Son. See, if God's love was eros love, it would have been love to possess his Son and therefore not give him up. But agapao, agape love, is love that gives. He that spared not his Son, but delivered him up for us all. And we see through this the love of God, verse 39. Nothing shall separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. So a technical definition of the word as such is really not what we're after, but rather an understanding of the concept behind the word. And the concept behind agape is just as I have described, love of the unworthy and a love that loves to give. Now the KJV has taken two words to express these love ideas, two chief words to express the phileo, let's say to express the phileo and the agapao terms. The KJV has taken two ideas, two terms. First of all, it's taken the term love, L-O-V-E, which is an old Saxon, S-A-X-O-N, Anglo-Saxon, which is an old Saxon word. Love is an old Saxon word that has many different shades of meaning. It all depends on the giver, the receiver, and the circumstances. That's one word. What's the other word the KJV took so many times for phileo, or particularly for agape? Charity. Charity was a Latin term that's used 28 times in the New Testament. It's a very poor selection. Charity, because today charity means good deeds. You know, you do deeds of charity. And when it was used, it was taken over from the Latin. Whenever it was used by the KJV writers, it meant something similar to love. 28 times. All but 7 of these are in Paul's epistles. So 21 of the 28 are in Paul's epistles. Jerome in the Vulgate was the first one to use this term, the Latin term behind our term charity. Jerome was the first one to use it. And it was picked up by Wycliffe in Wycliffe's translation back in the early part of this millennium. And then Wycliffe used it without any apparent system. And it's been carried down today in the KJV, likewise, without any apparent system. Why they give it in one chapter charity and it's agape, and the next chapter it's still agape, and they give it to us as love. They go from the Latin term back to the Saxon term for love. No one has been able to figure out. There appears to be no system whatsoever. It just appears to have been picked at random. Now your modern versions will correct that, but the charity terms really need to be corrected in the New Testament. You could go through a concordance and find those 28 times. 21 in Paul, most of them in Paul. Why they picked on Paul, I don't know. Okay. Not that many in John, you see. They gave us love in John. But what's in 1 Corinthians 13? Charity is kind. Charity suffereth long. Charity does not vaunt itself. When we get over to 1 John, God is charity. No, it's God is love now. They went from the Saxon back to the Latin with no apparent explanation.